Welcome to the latest episode of EdInfluence. I'm Nick Mackenzie from Brown Jacobson, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Bex Boomer-Clark, CEO of AET. Thank you, Bex, for joining me today. I wanted to start by inviting you to tell me a story from your life that would give me a picture of who you are as a leader.
Well, first of all, hi Nick, it's great to be here. A story from my life. I probably would always go back to my childhood, because one of the things I'm most grateful for is that I had a really blessed childhood. My parents were supportive and interested in what we were doing. I think that formative experiences live with you throughout your life and certainly affect your leadership. And I'd probably go back to being the sort of eldest of three. I do think that sort of sense of having a strong sense of responsibility for others right from the earliest days, I think is something which stays with you. And certainly when I was growing up, my sister's only 11 months younger than me, but I was certainly the one who always took control. We both went to boarding school. So less a story, more a bit of context, I guess. And I think that's definitely had an influence on my personality, my characteristics, and definitely I think my outlook. I was 8, Kate was 8 when we first went to boarding school because my dad was in the Navy. And I think that gave us a sense of, well, we had to have it, a sense of self-reliance, a sense of perspective, a sense of actually you had to make your own luck and find your own path through difficulties, because there wasn't always somebody there to pick you up. So I think that I'd probably lean into that less than a sort of direct anecdote. So the eldest sibling went to boarding school. And I guess the other sort of formative influence is that I've always been really active, interested in sort of sport and physical activity. I think that probably plays out in a sense of competitiveness now. But I wasn't sort of, although I played team sports, I wasn't sort of naturally a sort of, my sort of competitive instinct is more sort of holding myself to account for a high bar rather than necessarily holding others to account.
You talked about your sister going with you then. Was that about you as a team, or you having the responsibility of feeling like you had to look after your little sister?
Oh, I think it was definitely about, we were a team, although I would probably say that Kate was quite happy to ignore the fact that she was my younger sister for large periods of our schooling. We were a team, but there was definitely always a sense that I was looking out for her. And even if you sort of take sort of basic things, so my parents lived in South Devon and we went to school in Cornwall. So from the age of 8, we'd be travelling to and fro on a train together. I always bought the train tickets and sort of looked after them. When I actually left school, Kate was already in the sixth form by then, and we had this strange recollection that actually this was the first time that she'd bought train tickets because I'd always done it for her. So I think that does sort of stay with you and becomes a sort of characteristic of your leadership style. Some might call it controlling.
Thank you. So if we fast forward to today, then what would you say is the main motivation of your leadership today?
I just have an enormous belief in the potential of each generation of young people. I always knew I wanted to work in education right from sort of the earliest of ages. And once I went into sort of education, I knew that I could have the biggest impact actually and influence if I stepped into leadership. And I think that the things that drive me today are exactly the same things that took me into education in the first place. I just think that unless we get that right for every young person in this country, we will never realise our collective potential. And I really do see it as an entitlement. Today, working across 57 schools up and down the country, I guess the lens that I see that through most regularly is this sense of what will it take for context and family wealth to no longer be the greatest determinant of young people fulfilling their potential. And the reality is that although many of the barriers are very similar in different parts of the country, actually the contextual influences are very different, and therefore the solutions are very different. But for as long as it matters too much where you're born, and in terms of enabling you to access the very best start in life through your education, I'll be driven to continue to make a difference.
Thank you. And I was just to get a sense of your day to day. What within the, but I'm conscious this is a podcast going out, so there'll be limits on what you can say. But what sort of things are on your mind this week? What are you thinking about?
What am I thinking about this week? Well, this week it's half term, so it's a bit of an unusual week, I think, in a sense that I've always worked in schools, so I'm really sort of wedded to the sort of rhythm of the academic year, the sort of running hard for a period of time, then sort of stopping, taking check. So in the half-term weeks and the breaks, I really appreciate the opportunity and the chance to just sort of think clearly, but slightly further ahead. And I think that's something which I've built in as a real habit and a routine now. I am, this year in particular, I'm quite sort of fixated on this concept of having a time strategy, time as our sort of greatest resource, and how we utilize that as an asset, both for ourselves individually, but also for our sort of organization collectively. And so I'm really thinking hard about, well, what is it that we have to do this year in order to realize something that's never been achieved before in the context of our sort of 2028 ambitions in 5 years' time. So yeah, it's not a sort of, there's not a long list of issues. It's that sense of taking time to stop and take stock. And I think that's a really important thing to do, and to build time to do.
That's interesting. I like that phrase, a time strategy. So what, outside half term, what do you do in a busy week to make time to think as a leader? And what are the sorts of questions you like to get to when you're thinking?
Outside, one of the great things about my job is that no week is the same. I like to have a rhythm. I think the weeks where I don't have a sort of rhythm and a routine, I sort of feel that a little bit. For me, it's when I exercise. So I run a lot, and that's my thinking time. And I make time every day to do that. And I think that bookend to the day is vital to both sort of look ahead and plan and sort of think through conversations with individuals, but also then to sort of reflect back at the end of each day, and to sort of think about, well, actually, what was my personal influence and impact in each of the situations that I found myself in. And I wouldn't say that I do that in sort of a rigid way. I don't particularly take time to sort of journal or write diaries or anything like that, though I have huge admiration for people that do. But I definitely have a sort of mental rhythm and a routine. And I've built that into my sort of daily commute and daily travel. So it happens whether I like it or not.
So one of my earlier guests, Anne Lim, she talks about the power of quiet influence in leadership. And I was wondering whether you could share your reflections on when deciding when to lead by using, say, quiet influence, and when to use the formal power of the role. So, for example, the power of being a CEO.
Well, I think the people that know me well would know that sort of quiet is probably not something that they would necessarily associate with me. But I think it's something that actually, particularly in this role, I've had to sort of learn to step back and take greater pleasure from sort of stepping back and seeing what's happening, once removed. I think that there is a reality. I mean, we have 57 schools, so that's sort of 58 sites if you count our sort of central office. And although we're one organisation, actually you have to have confidence in the power of sort of quiet influence when actually you need to lead through, for us, 57 school principals. It's not a role where you can be directive. I think that it's easier to lean into that space if you have got a clarity of direction and vision, and that's saved. And so I think it's important for us to be able to exert a quiet influence, but it comes from a real clarity of direction. And I think that there's a wider piece. I mean, I'm speaking into the importance of influence within AET in that context, but I take really seriously our responsibility to the system and the sector, and my personal responsibility to the system and the sector. And sometimes when you have a platform, it's important that you use that to speak out on behalf of others who may not have such a significant voice.
Yeah, and picking up on that theme, how would you say you use your leadership and AET uses its leadership to lift others up?
One of the first things that was important to me was to create what we now call Project H. I've been a believer for a long time that actually the sector is all of our responsibility. And I think when I was working in the Southwest and David Carter was the RSC, he used to say that actually, if you're leading a great school, but schools around you are struggling, that's not strong system leadership. And I really believe that's true. And we speak to our leaders as being responsible for 33,000 young people, many of whom they will never meet. So Project H is a movement, really, a platform where we made a commitment to share our journey, if you like. I hate the phrase journey. I think it's overused, but I inherited an organisation that had been through quite a tumultuous period of financial turnaround, and very much the work is making sure that we now realise the educational potential of all of our schools and our young people through them, but also that sense that what can we do to document the progress that we're making year on year in a way that actually adds value to others? And so we share often through through blogs and articles at the moment, but sort of increasingly through events where we have sort of direct discourse between people, both what's working, but also what isn't, because my experience has often been that people wait until something is incredibly shiny and well proven, and very often the gap between where that organisation or that resource is and actually the people that could learn most from it is too wide. And part of that is implementation, part of that's context. And I also firmly believe from my own leadership that I think you sort of learn from your mistakes. And I'm sort of not sort of the big catastrophes, although you have to take learning from those too, but also the moments where actually, if you'd just taken a slightly different approach, you may have got further faster. So yeah, Project H is our big sort of platform vehicle, and we also wanted to sort of try and break down what's become an increasingly, I think, tribal discourse in education. Polarized camps where conversations are essentially taking place with people waiting for the right moment to sort of prove their point, as opposed to sort of listening to the wisdom in difference. And we were excited. It's a slow burn piece, and it's also important for us internally, because if you have that commitment to sort of publicly share what you're doing, it's like it lifts the bar in terms of expectations of sort of quality and rigor. So there's a cultural factor to it.
That's interesting. I was just wondering as I was listening to you speak, because you started off saying how competitive you were in terms of that feature in your leadership, and I was wondering whether that competitive drive drove you to. You talked about sometimes people want to wait till it's polished and perfect before sharing the learnings, but sharing it raw. Was that a brave step, or did it just feel like a natural step?
For me, it felt like a natural step, and it's just a real privilege to be in a position to be able to take something which is possibly as much about personal conviction as anything else, and to make that something which is relevant to both the heart of our organisation, but also that sort of wider system contribution. And I think that I think it's really important that we all step into that space. And I think it's possible to be competitive and collaborative. I think where that comes into difficulty is where you are competitive and constantly comparative. And I think that's the challenge. That's one of the biggest challenges that we have, certainly in terms of the sort of influence of public accountability on schools and what that does for the psyche of leaders across the sector. So I'm all for competition, but I believe in collaboration.
And thinking about you as an organisation, I imagine you have a challenge or two, and it can conflict and challenge your core values. You described your motivation and what was driving you. I was wondering whether you could talk to me about how you sort of navigate the challenges of ensuring that your leadership stays true to your values and what you're driving for when you're buffeted by those inevitable crosswinds, headwinds, and that. I suppose I'm thinking about navigating situations where you're faced with doing the expedient thing or taking perhaps the harder path that may have some short-term pain but is truer, feels truer, more authentic to what you're trying to do.
I mean, I think my natural position is always to sort of take the hard path. And I have a sort of tendency to run towards challenges, right from the earliest days of my first headship. I was attracted to challenge. And I think that you can't be attracted to challenge and not realize that you actually are going to need to do some things differently and to sort of realize new paths that nobody's followed yet. So how do I say to you that? I think that there is something that's quite natural in me. I also think that it's so important that you have people around you who will just be, your fiercest critics as well as your most loyal friends. And I think that I am fortunate enough to have people around me, be that sort of colleagues, friends who know me well enough to be able to sort of always course correct and keep me honest. And I think it's important to be proactive in terms of seeking other people's advice. And I'm really, really fortunate in that space. And then now, as I've sort of, we've got our senior team at AET is now established. I think it's building a culture in a high-performing executive team to be able to sort of challenge one another in a way that's sort of supportive but candid.
And how have you gone about creating that team? Could you share some of your reflections of from joining AET and how you've gone about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are critics who've looked at the team in AET from afar and sort of said, what are those strange job titles? I think I always had a sense of, I understand the sort of premise that running a multi-academy trust is effectively running a very large school that operates across multiple sites. And I think that there are many ways to do this job well. But actually, our role as a sort of central organisation is very much to sort of facilitate and enable each of our schools and each of the leaders in our schools to be exceptional. And that means providing them with different support and challenge, be that related to sort of context or geography or levels of performance. And so we need to be quite agile as a team. And I set out to sort of get a balance of different skill sets. So we have got people on our team, we've got myself included. There are three members of the senior team with direct experience of leading schools and education. But by far the greater number of people on our team have come from a wide range of different career paths. And I think that diversity of thought and experience is something which I actively sought, but also now sort of daily appreciate. So we've got my chief operating officer, James, it came originally from RM and technology. I've got director of strategy, came from Bain as a management consultant. So just a really different breadth of experience. We've created a new role. So we have I think what is first for the sector, a chief talent officer. So to separate out the sort of transactional aspects of HR and our people work and really have an absolute focus on talent. And Joe originally came to us from the private sector as well. So I think that getting that balance is really important. And then building routines. One thing which and it might be a little unpopular, although I accept that the reality of hybrid working is here to stay, I'm also really insistent that we spend enough time together in person, because I think it is incredibly challenging to build those sort of social bonds and a depth of trust by interacting with people over a screen, even when you're making an effort to sort of create sort of strange, artificial, relaxed interactions. I just don't think that you get the same level of performance. So I think that there's that breadth of experience and diversity, but also time together is really, really important.
And that How's that going in terms of getting that balance of the time together? Are you where you want to be?
I mean, I probably always want a little bit more, if I'm honest. But I accept that the world is a different place now, coming out of the pandemic. What I think we're really clear about is when we do come together, what the purpose is. Because equally, I recognise that in a world where people were together sort of 5 days a week, actually there was quite a lot of wasted time. So I think that we see that time together as incredibly important and precious, and it needs to be well structured, and we need to have a clarity of a clear sense of what our key objectives are. I mean, we're sort of in a place where 3 days out of 5 we're together, and often it's more than that. Sometimes it's less than that, and we run to the rhythm of the academic year, so we take a slightly different approach out of term time. I very much believe that we exist to serve our schools, and there is a rigidity to the model of schooling, which I think we need to be respectful of when we exist in service of them.
Thank you. And when we talk about leadership, quotes are often thrown around and they're often misattributed. But I was wondering what your reaction was to one that I stumbled across relatively recently, where it is a leader is a dealer in hope. How important do you think hope is in a leader?
I think it's incredibly important. I think if you were to push me and say what's essential to see you through challenging times, but also to navigate a path to realise the full possibility of any organisation, particularly one in education where actually we trade in human potential. I think that optimism is absolutely essential. And I would set that alongside hope, as you mentioned. I'd also set that alongside a sense of ambition, which is tempered by a real sense of imagination. I go back to my first experience leading a school where I became the principal of an incredibly challenging secondary school in the first phase of the Academies movement in really unexpected circumstances. And was hugely underqualified for the job. I'd been the deputy for 12 weeks, and that was my first deputy headship. And in that context, which, as I say, at the time, the school was the lowest performing secondary school and the lowest performing local authority in the country. So it doesn't really get much more difficult in many respects. But when you're faced with what could seem like insurmountable challenge, actually the ability to see the possibility in those difficulties, but also to seek the solutions that are in front of you. I do believe that the majority of solutions are in front of you. That's not to say that you shouldn't seek outside influences and counsel, but actually most of the challenges that organisations and schools face, the resource, the talent, the expertise to actually take control of a situation and be the master of your own destiny is very often within each organisation. And so I think you have to have a degree of hope to be able to sort of step into that adversity, but also see where it could go. And the school that I led had been struggling for multiple generations. It had not been good for a couple of decades by any judgment. And so in that particular context, I remember going there on my first day when I was for my interview, and I nearly walked away because I recognised immediately the level of challenge, and I'd never actually seen a school that was in such a state of chaos. There are many reasons why I didn't walk away, but I think that's been a really helpful leadership lesson, which is the sense of you can step into any situation so long as you have a clarity about actually what it could become. You can work your way through the challenges that are in front of you, and most tools and resources are also alongside you to sort of make progress.
You've talked a few times about heading directly towards challenges. I was wondering, when things get really tough, how do you go about finding people who'll give you energy to keep you with that ambition?
I mean, to be fair, it's not hard when you work in schools. If the greatest moments that sort of re-energize me are when I get to spend time in our schools, when I get to meet our young people. I always get a huge amount of sort of energy when I meet our new trainee teachers. We talk a great deal, don't we, about the recruitment crisis in education at the moment, and that is absolutely a challenge for all of us. But actually, we don't talk enough about the incredible talent that we attract into the profession every single year, and the sort of sense of possibility that they bring to those sort of early years of training, and the quality of that, which is so far away from the quality of teacher training when I first started out of university. So I think that there's something in just the fact that we work around young people in schools that is innately energizing. And then, as I said earlier, I think it's about having people around you that keep you honest. Many of my friends are my oldest friends from my time at boarding school. They certainly give me a sense of perspective and know me well, which I think it's important. One of the pieces of advice that I would give to anybody stepping into a challenging leadership role is that you should always take your work seriously, but you should never take yourself too seriously.
Indeed. And just listening to you talking about some of your oldest friends still having the connection and being part of your support network, I was thinking of Owen Eastwood wrote a wonderful book called Belonging, which was essentially reflecting on the primal need of humans to sort of belong to a group in order to thrive. And you talked about it as an executive group. Thinking of the organisation on a bigger scale, what would your reflections be on how you've gone about fostering that sort of feeling of belonging at AET, or even within teams within AET?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was probably one of the biggest challenges when I joined. The organisation had been, I guess, galvanised by the adversity of financial turnaround, but it wasn't looking very far ahead of itself. And there wasn't a sense of enough space for the brilliant people within AET to actually come together, collaborate, talk about the things that really matter, and work together around shared and common problems. That was essentially the gap. And Project H, as I say, was a really important vehicle in terms of stepping into that space. The other thing that's been absolutely essential is to say, it's absolutely right that our schools should reflect the colour and context of their local communities, and we talk a lot about localism. Although if you're serious about every child having an entitlement to excellence, regardless of what part of the country they live in, there have to be some things that you hold true in all of your schools. But we definitely don't believe in sort of a cookie cutter approach to education. And I get very concerned when I sort of observe the headship role gradually being eroded. The most important leaders in our organisation are our heads, and they have to have the space, the agency, the autonomy to be able to operate. And I really believe that if you take all of those resources and decisions and centralise, and it just becomes a role of implementing an education blueprint, we are going to have an enormous leadership crisis on our hands, because talented people just won't be attracted to that as a proposition. But that said, if you're serious about an entitlement, you need to be clear about what that means. And we talk about that in terms of what we call AET 490. And AET 490 are the ambitious goals that we've set ourselves, which is to be the first organisation that breaks 90% for chronological reading age, for phonics, at the end of year 6 in read, write, maths, expected standard, and in grade 4 basics in English and maths at the end of year 11. And we went public with those goals. And I actually, when I first spoke to our heads at conference and sort of said, look, many of you will think that I've temporarily taken leave of my senses. But actually, I think we have to ask ourselves the question of what will it take? what will it take for 90% of our young people to reach what, if we're really honest about, is not an inaccessible bar. And actually, for those that is insurmountable, actually the 10%, what's seriously ambitious in terms of success for them? And that's so important, because we have 5 special schools within our network of schools. And reimagining what success looks like for those young people is just as important to us. And it has been a galvanizing force. So we've got the young people that are in joining our secondary schools in year 7, age sort of 11 this September, the young people who are in year 2 in our primary schools. We ask ourselves every day, what is it going to take to realise the full potential of the young people in front of us, and recognise that we will need to do many things better, but that will probably only get us to 70%. And actually starting to think about, well, what is it that we need to do fundamentally differently to realise a level of performance that's never been achieved before? And that has been, as I say, incredibly powerful, because sometimes setting a goal, but also creating the enabling conditions around leaders for them to feel, well, why shouldn't it be us? Why if not, why not us? Why can't we be the team of leaders and professionals who find the way to enabling more and more young people to fulfill their potential? That, I think, is really sort of liberating, slightly terrifying at times, but really liberating.
And does that feature into Project H in terms of some of the lessons you're learning? Is that part of the stuff you're sharing through that project as well with others?
Yeah,
and
definitely.
What's the response been so far from others where you've shared that? What's your learnings, reflections on early sort of sense?
I think many people externally, although I don't know that they say this to me directly, probably think it's a pretty risky strategy to go out there and say, this is what we're going for. I'm really relaxed, actually. I think that, and I've been very clear, we might not get there. We might not get there, but we will get an awful lot closer to 90% by making that our goal than we will do if we settle for less. And for me, it's a statement of our belief in the potential of our young people. And it is placing upon us a sense of responsibility to release that potential. So I do think that there are many who probably go, that's fairly punchy. I also think that there's something about being clear that you're going to stay the course. So when I took on this role, I knew that this was a 10-year commitment at least. And I just don't think it's possible, actually, to do something significant and difficult at scale if you only see it through sort of 2, 3, 4-year cycles. It comes back to that sense of time. You asked how you weather adversity and different challenges. If you've set your sights on a goal which is in the future, and you've made a personal 10-year commitment, actually you're in a much stronger position to sort of weather the challenges that and the storms that buffet you in the day-to-day, in the here and now.
And on the talent piece, you mentioned the talent director in your senior team. What are some of the ideas, things you're looking to work on there? Because you said you thought it was a first perhaps in the sector.
Yeah, I mean, we've recently, last year we established our new operating model. So we've got a 5 regional model, which is really important to us, particularly in terms of that belief in localism. We've got regional education directors, so primary and a secondary regional education directors, 1 to 2 in each region. And so one of the starting points was to really think hard about that role, because there are many people who have the title sort of regional director, regional education director. But I think it's one of the most challenging roles actually in education, because generally the people that move into it have been really successful heads. And I often say to heads that you will never have more autonomy and space than you have as a head. Even if it doesn't feel like that all the time, in reality, you will never have more autonomy. And it's quite a difficult thing to step into a space where you need to be a leader of leaders, where you are leading through people, where actually you need to have a sort of an external profile within a local area, but also you're operating within a wider network, and so we were really, really keen to be thoughtful about that role, because I've seen many examples of regional director roles just becoming sort of captain compliance functions, and I think that's a sort of it's not sort of particularly nourishing leadership role for an individual to undertake. I don't think it plays to the talents of the people that we want to attract into those roles. I don't think it builds the next generation of CEOs, which I think is a real responsibility, particularly in sort of large networks of schools. And I think it often makes head teachers miserable if they feel that they've basically got a whole load of checklists, compliance checklists to jump through. So for all of those reasons, we wanted to be thoughtful about how that role was developed. And so the starting point for Jo was to really break down what that role is and isn't, to create a framework which sets it into context of the experience that people bring into the post, but also the experiences you want them to gain through the first 3 years in those roles. And we've been very clear, again, this sense of time. You can't come into this job and do it well unless you're going to give us at least 3 years, preferably 5. And so that sense of commitment, which means that we can be much more thoughtful in terms of the development. What else we've done? We created from in the first year, we forged a partnership with Ark Teacher Training. I was at Ark before I was at AET. In my opinion, it's one of the very best teacher training programs in the country. We didn't have the capacity or the expertise to establish our own teacher training route within AET, but I think it's so important to bring that talent in. So straight away, we sort of established that partnership. We've seen the first cohort go through. We've got the next cohort going through. Having a clarity about how somebody can build a career with AET through the different phases of both their work, but also their sort of wider life outside of work, and it to feel sustainable and energizing has been really important. So yeah, a huge amount of different things. And then we've done the other piece of work that Jo is developing is thinking hard about actually how do we design work in schools to properly start to get underneath the workload challenge, because it's not about just asking teachers to do less. I think it's about asking us to work differently. And that's an interesting space, which starts to encroach on the possibilities of technology as well.
You've mentioned a few times, you've referred to network of schools. I was just, that struck me in terms of it's quite a deliberate use of phrase. What's behind that?
I think one of the most powerful forces in any context is the power of networks, of people, what people can do when they're connected behind a sort of shared endeavour or common purpose. And I think that naturally we can be quite hierarchical in education. And I think that can have a constraining influence. And I certainly think it sort of speaks into the sort of public accountability challenge of, I think we're much more focused on lifting the bottom than we are of elevating the top in terms of schools in this country. And there are many reasons for that. But I think that is a real challenge for us. So I lost my train of thought actually on terms of that. Well, take me back to your question.
So I was asking what was behind in terms of you thinking of your
the network
schools as networks.
Yeah. So I'm back on track. So if you think about how networks act, so I'll show my age now. Think about Facebook and how that took off in a certain direction. You have to be prepared, if you believe in the power of network dynamics, to have a degree of space, and you have to have the confidence to know that actually people will run into spaces that you haven't anticipated. So that sense of a real clarity of direction for us through 490, a real discipline in culture, which is developed through Project H, but then having the space for brilliant people to be connected and to take us in directions that we may not anticipate, and to be confident enough to go with them, has been really, really important. And so we describe it as our architecture for collaboration. And I think one of the fundamental roles of a national trust in particular, but I would say in any trust, is actually for us the challenge, I say fundamental for us because of our scale and sort of relative dispersion, is to find ways for people to stay connected. So, you know, every subject and phase leader in AET is connected to a subject or phase group that is led by one of their peers. We don't dictate the agenda for those groups, but we do resource them to go in different directions. And it takes a bit of time. So it's not something that you can force or inflict upon people. It very much is about wanting to create a movement, I think, where like-minded people can come together and do their best work. And to get away from that sort of caps and compliance tendency. Now, don't get me wrong. I think that you have to create the conditions to be able to collaborate. So, you know, one of the most powerful sources of sort of insight is our sort of academic data set. You know, unless we were teaching children of the same age the same things at the same time, and that's, I'm not saying on a day-by-day, on a lesson-by-lesson basis, but certainly across the course of an academic year, we couldn't assess meaningfully. And if we can't assess meaningfully, we lose access to a rich source of insight. So there are certain things that just, we can't all be out there. You have to sort of have the structures and the frameworks that make it possible. But finding the sweet spot between having those structures and frameworks, which are evidence-informed, but also creating the space for individuals, be they leaders or be they sort of main scale teachers in our schools, to have the space to innovate is really important. And you never quite get there. It's constantly sort of seeing how it's being held in tension.
Unfortunately, we're starting to get towards the end of our time. There's a few things left. I just wanted to ask you. One, I'm struck a number of times you've talked about, particularly yourself, a very long-term thinking, long-term view, and taking some sort of tough calls and sort of really raising the bar and setting some challenges. I was wondering whether you could talk a bit about your relationship and how it works with the chair, because I imagine that's quite a key part of taking some of these decisions and views. I was just wondering, as a CEO, I imagine the chair role is quite a key one for you.
Yeah, and I think if I was advising somebody who's thinking about stepping into a CEO role, I think even if you've had exposure working with boards before, I think you don't underestimate actually how much of your role is actually working with your board, working with your chair, building a strong relationship, and getting maximum value out of people who are essentially volunteers, but come with sort of a sort of rich breadth of different experience and expertise. I'm really fortunate in that my chair and actually our wider board of trustees naturally, I think, take a longer term view. They encourage us to take informed risks. I think they have seen recently we've sort of made pleasing improvements in terms of our sort of academic outputs, but also in terms of our sort of internal sort of engagement indicators, which give them a confidence to sort of push us to go harder. So I think that I'm very fortunate in the sense that often it's me that's saying, actually, I'm not sure we can go quite that far just yet. We need to have another year of gains in order for us to be confident that we can take those risks. But certainly in the space, and I think our board are naturally curious. So in the space around time and technology, they've been really thoughtful and encouraging in us sort of exploring that. I think just looking at the makeup of the exec team at AET, that's a board which is comfortable with engaging with external influences and bringing them to bear in education. So it's I feel fortunate in that respect.
Two final questions, and feel free to be quite brief in your answer, Beck. So what would you say brings you, let's say, 80% of your joy as a leader?
Seeing others be successful, be they adults or children.
What would be the best advice that you would give to an aspiring or a learning leader?
Be thoughtful about your own personal leadership. know yourself well enough to know the habits and routines that you need to follow in order to be able to sort of sustain your own levels of energy. Experience is important, but it needs to be coupled with expertise. And learn how to work hard and play hard.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, Bex, for joining me today. I've thoroughly enjoyed our discussion, and I do hope our listeners have too. And I look forward to you joining us in our next in our series of EdInfluence podcasts. Thank you.